Welcome everybody to one of the last moments of the public programs of the Istanbul Biennial, 14th edition. Then comes the 15th and then the 16th and wonderful other public programs. In the meantime, we are here for the second session of something called Thought Forms and Brain Waves, Neuro-Aesthetics and Art, which is a series of encounters initiated by Marcos Lutyens, who is not here, but he is sort of here. He's in his studio, and it's very early in the morning in California. Hello, Marcos.
Hello.
So,
Nice to be here.
yes, given that you initiated it, it's nice that you're here somehow. In any case, I'm really very, very happy to introduce this panel, which is going to contain a series of talks, lectures, and a little bit of Q&A. And the people who are speaking are Vittorio Gallese, who is to my far left, and thank you for coming to join us here in such a special moment, the end of the biennial, and also 2 days before your elections. I wish you all the best possible. And Vittorio Gallese trained as a neurologist, and he is a professor of physiology at the very, very, very renowned Department of Neuroscience in the University of Parma, Italy. Now, Italy has, over the last 30 years, really only produced two major things, aside from great art, arte povera. One is slow food, and the second is mirror neurons. And the concept of mirror neurons is actually something that Vittorio Gallese, together with Rizzolatti and the team of Parma, discovered and coined this term, which has so affected neuroscience worldwide. And it has also affected political thinking, because it is from the discovery of mirror neurons, the fact that when we see someone being hit, we sometimes feel the pain in our own bodies, that the study of empathy and the relationship between empathy and collectivity or politics has actually developed. He's done many other things and has recently been interested in also fontana paintings, so the slashed paintings, and he has worked together with our friend David Friedberg, the director of the Warburg, in some very, very key works concerning Neuro-Aesthetics, which is the joining of the knowledges from neurology and neuroscience with the knowledges of aesthetics and art history, and see if one can come up with something useful or interesting. The other speaker here is Pietro, and Vittorio will do the first talk, which is called The Problem of Images, Embodied Simulation and Experimental Aesthetics. The second talk will be by Pietro Rigolo, who is one of the youngest scholars that I've met and that has had an incredible impact on my thinking. When I was at the Getty in Los Angeles, he walks up and down the halls of the archive with these big boxes of documents belonging to Harold Zeman, and is the world expert really on Zeman, although you never met directly. No. But asked me about him a lot.
Yes.
Yes.
And I saw a few shows with him.
And you saw a few shows with him. So Pietro, I provoked, because of his mind and the way he thinks, into looking at Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater and their writing around thought forms. I provoked him because he was already interested in the question, because Harold Zeman had an interest in theosophy and had some notes about Annie Besant in the archive. And so Pietro, as a great art historian and scholar, an imaginative person, wrote a talk for us which is called A Radiating Vibration and a Floating Form, Thought Forms and Intersubjectivity. And then we have Marcos Lutyens, who is one of the artists participating in the biennial, his work is actually an environment within which to be hypnotized. And when there is no hypnosis going, there are a number of elements in the installation which also concern bodily knowledges and memories and different altered states of perception, from when one is from being blind to being in different conditions. Is that right, Marcus?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So Marcus will be speaking about, again, a little bit Annie Besant, because he met with Ramachandran, who is one of the greatest neuroscientists of our time. Ramachandran is the man who developed that wonderful box, which is in the channel in Istanbul Modern, which is a box to cure the symptoms of phantom limb disorders, when you have lost a limb in an accident and you continue to feel pain on the edges where there is no more arm. Ramachandran had the idea to use a mirror in a box where a therapy would contain seeing your existing hand represented in a mirror in the same box. So it connects a little bit with, let's say, representation and healing and the connection of the mirror image. And so there is a vague relationship with Gallese's work. But the reason Ramachandran was brought into this meeting is because he's one of the first Neuro-Aesthetics writers in our times. He wrote some of the earliest texts on the subject. And together with Marcus Lutyens, they devised a test during the biennial to ask visitors if they somehow had the same mental associations with the thought forms that Annie Besant had identified with certain thoughts, certain forms and colors with certain thoughts. So we will hear a little bit the results of their research. And then, and also you have a recording of Ramachandran, who is unable to travel. He's a rather ill man. And is that correct? You will show a short video. Yeah, Marcus, yes. And then finally, if for those of you who have the patience to stay, maybe after a coffee, I'm going to close with a lecture that really has something and nothing to do with this whole subject. And it is called On Thought Forms, Annie Besant, Mad Science, Love and Politics. And I wrote it yesterday and changed the lecture. So that's that. So that said, I would like to, without further ado, passare la parola to Vittorio Gallese.
Hi.
Hi, buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Nice to meet you.
So you will do the next slide?
Yeah.
So you have to start here.
Okay. Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Today I had a very deep visit to part of the Biennale. I couldn't see all of it because it's huge, but it was very thought-provoking, and I think I'll need a couple of days to think about all the stimuli, intellectual and aesthetic stimuli that I got. My talk today deals with something that has been obsessing me during the last 10 years or something, the problem of images. Beside the problem of images, there is even a more excruciating problem for someone like me who tries to address some of the usual questions we keep asking about ourselves, looking through the peeping hole of the brain and the body. So this is a very peculiar vantage point. And this excruciating problem is how comes that we are able to constantly inhabit different worlds, the world of reality, as we wish to call it, the things that we can touch, the physical presence of objects, but at the same time we can easily move into a parallel world of fiction, of representation, watching a movie, beholding some visual art, reading a novel. How it comes that those parallel worlds can be so vivid, so exciting, but at the same time we are fully aware that they do not belong to the real world that we inhabit in our daily business. And this is a very complex issue. I don't think we will have a final answer just by asking questions to the brain. By asking questions to the brain, we enrich our perspective, adding the possibility to see at those problems from a different angle that has to be discussed in a dialogue with a more usual perspective that have been spending time on these problems since probably the beginning of our species. I would like to start with a quote from a novel that I just finished, which I like a lot, from a Spanish novel writer, Javier Cercas, which in a way embodies what I take to be one of the features of our research. We all acknowledge the importance of language, but I believe that the importance of language has been perhaps magnified in the last 50, 70 years, particularly after the so-called linguistic turn. It's time to look beside language to other non-linguistic forms of expression and of communication. This is the end of this beautiful novel, because words are only made for saying to each other, for saying the sayable, when the sayable is everything except what rules us or makes us live or matters or what we are. So there's a huge field which is beyond the reach of words. I think all the problems that we address are relevant to the extent that also help us in clarifying what we live now. So I just would like to start with the Syrian catastrophe. I had been reading a lot of journalistic reports on the crisis, reading tables, figures, describing how the people from Syria were forced to leave their country because of the war, which is happening there. So a lot of information could be gathered by people, but the people seem to be interested at a very intellectual level. And even watching TV reports, this is a picture taken from the city of Cobain, the impact of these reports were, I would say, quite mild in steering a sort of upsurge of the public opinion. It took an image, a series of images that were so powerful, and I just decided to select one of those images, perhaps not the most powerful one, about this poor child that died on the shore of this country as fleeing from Greece. And after these pictures were, we could analyze this picture from a variety of points of view. I think something that has not been properly addressed is that they were so powerful because this poor child in the West looked like one of our children. And this is something that should make us think. But anyway, these images steered a lot of reaction all over the western part of Europe, leading many people to march in the street and finally realize that there is a huge crisis on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea and taking action. So what mostly moves people to take action is the power of images and of their narration, the possibility to directly feel with and for specific individuals on the basis of the partial identification, mimesis, and projections these images evoke in beholders. Abstract knowledge simply can't. So I think this snapshot on what's going on in current times further legitimates a bottom-up approach to aesthetics. Aesthetics, I'm not interested in the sense of beauty. I'm not interested in finding a place in the brain for the sublime. I'm happy to leave this enterprise to distinguished colleagues of ours who are specifically investigating this. What interests me is the notion of experience. I don't have time to develop this, but I think that cognitive neuroscience can be, from an heuristic point of view, really powerful if it is able to address the notion of experience, how we experience our life, how we experience the world, how we experience others. And when neuroscientists normally speak about art, they speak about vision. And when they speak about vision, they speak about the visual part of the brain. And what I have been doing in the last 20 years with my research, together with my colleagues, has been specifically to challenge this sort of visual brain imperialism, according to which we feel with somatosensory areas, we move with motor areas, and we see with visual areas. So, observing the world is far more complex than the mere activation of the visual brain, as we call it, as it implies a multimodal notion of vision. Observing the world encompasses the activation of motor, somatosensory, emotion-related components within the larger frame of the intrinsic pragmatic nature of every intentional relation with the world that we may establish. So in other words, if you want to radicalize to the most extreme point this line of thought, one might want to say that perception is a modality of action. These ideas have been around for quite a long time. This guy is Heinrich Wölfflin. Wölfflin is normally in the history of art and aesthetics addressed as one of the proponents of pure visibility, as Benedetto Croce would have called it. But this excerpts is from his PhD dissertation, Prolegomena on Psychology of Architecture. Physical forms possess a character only because we ourselves possess a body. If we were purely visual beings, we would always be denied an aesthetic judgment of the physical world. But as human beings with a body that teaches us the nature of gravity, contraction, strength, and so on, we gather the experience that enable us to identify with the conditions of other forms. So we have already here the notion that we see things with the entire body. So vision is a bodily enterprise which put into action, seen from the vantage point of the brain, not only the parts of the brain that are specialized to process the input that come from the retina and travel to the geniculate body, and from them to V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6, the so-called extrastriate visual areas, but we see with touch, we see with the motor system, we see with our guts. On top, you see the macaque monkey brain. Bottom, you see the human brain. And the color codes were specifically chosen to emphasize the analogy in the organization of the motor part of the neocortex of non-human primates and of the human brain. Premotor and posterior parietal area that you see, described in these cartoons are reciprocally interconnected and do many things related to our perception of the world. Cortical motor areas contain the neurons that control the execution of our movement, but they also respond to tactile, auditory, and visual stimuli. So they integrate a multimodal inputs coming from a variety of different sensory channels. And on the other hand, posterior parietal areas, which were traditionally considered to process and associate purely sensory information, also play a role in motor control. And I just want to frame mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are not magical cells. Mirror neurons display a property which is shared by many other classes of neurons living nearby. Namely, they control motor output, but they also use this motor frame in order to decode perceptual stimuli. For example, the neuron sitting in this area F4, this area contains neurons that controls arm reaching and orienting movement of the hand. But the very same neurons that turn the head or move the arm also respond to tactile stimuli applied to those same very body parts, and also respond to visual stimuli moving into these three-dimensional geometric solids anchored to that part of the body. So a way of formalizing the perceptual working of this neuron is to hold that they perceptually work by means of embodied motor simulation. Seeing something or hearing something at a given location within what we call the peripersonal space, the working space, the space that we can reach stretching out our arm, evokes the motor simulation of the most appropriate act towards those very same spatial location. So these neurons show a double profile of activation. They can guide movement, guiding my reaching movement to this bottle, but they can also fire with no movement being produced. They simulate the movement, and this motor simulation contribute to my possibility to perceive this object as a potential target of an action. And what is more interesting is that even we humans have this brain circuit displaying the same functional properties. This is taken from a paper published in 2000. It's an fMRI paper showing that a similar network in parietal and premotor cortex contain neurons behaving in a similar way as those that we recorded originally in the macaque monkey brain. And again, nothing new. If we read the Phenomenology of Perception that Merleau-Ponty wrote in 1945, we read sentences like this: space is not a sort of ether in which all things float. The points in space mark in our vicinity, what we define nowadays as peripersonal space, the varying range of our aims and our gestures. So the idea is that the motor system, which maps the motor potentiality expressed by our body, and our body in turn express a certain type of motor potentialities, because our body, it's the outcome of an evolutionary process that forces living creatures to adapt to a physical reality that has specific features, okay? In a premotor area which sits just in front of the one that I just briefly described to you, area F5, you find neurons that control grasping movements. So these are distal neurons. They control grasping of objects of different shape and size. So this specific neuron, for example, controls the grasping, a very peculiar form of grasping. The monkey has the possibility to look at and grasp different objects, but only when inserting the tip of the index finger in a tiny little ring and pulling it, this drives the cell. So for the other object, there's barely no signal at all. What is interesting is that the very same neuron that controls this particular type of grasping will show the very same level of selectivity when the monkey is merely looking at the object. No movement is required. Nevertheless, the same neuron would fire, even if it is not controlling any movement. It is simulating the grasping. So this particular object affords a variety of interaction. The might be different according to my goal. I can grasp this bottle, so this is one affordance. Then I want to uncap. So this size of the object affords another type of action. When merely looking at this object, even if I'm not thirsty and I don't want to drink from this bottle, beside the visual neuron analyzing the shape, the size, the color, and the orientation of this object, there are other neurons in my motor system translating those visual features in affordances that map this object as a potential intentional object of my action, okay? And so again, how do these canonical neurons perceptually work? Again, by embodied motor simulation. Seeing a manipulable object evokes the motor simulation of its grasping. Seeing the object evokes an object-related motor potentiality. And finally, we come to mirror neurons. We discovered them in those very same area while we were investigating the visual properties of canonical neurons. We were grasping objects and showing them to the monkey, and one day in July of 1991, we realized that some of these neurons were not firing when we were presenting the object to the monkey, but before, when we were grasping the object in order to present it to the monkey. We were puzzled, we thought it was an artifact. It took a few months to realize we grabbed something new, and from that moment onwards, the excitement in the lab increased exponentially. So basically, mirror neurons show this double attitude, like all the neurons that I show you so far. They control action, they fire every time the monkey grasps an object with the hand, with the mouth. There are neurons that control both. But also when the monkey is doing nothing but looking at someone else performing the same action. And to make a big jump and to move on our brain, these are the part of our brain that turned out to be activated both when we perform or we observe similar gestures, movements, or goal-related actions in our brain. So you have the posterior parietal cortex, the dorsal ventral premotor cortex, the posterior part of Broca's region, which is not doing just language, so to speak, but I won't go into that because it would lead me too far, and the superior temporal sulcus region. And one distinguishing feature between macaques and humans is that the motor palette, so to speak, that evokes this motor simulation is much wider in our brain with respect to the brain of macaques. But this is clearly just the tip of an iceberg. With an American philosopher, Alvin Goldman, in 2000, we ventured to speculate that mirror neurons for actions could be just the tip of an iceberg of a much bigger one. So namely, they could betray a wider types of mirroring mechanism relating to tactile sensation and to emotions. And indeed, we were able to discover that there are other parts of the brain, for example, the anterior insula, that show this type of double activation pattern. This area normally activates when you are inhaling, for example, disgusting odorants, when you genuinely and subjectively feel disgust. But it is also activated when you watch the facial expression of someone else doing like this, showing disgust, okay? And analogously, this still in many textbooks of neuroscience, S2 is considered to be a somatosensory area, where you have a bilateral map of the tactile body. So they touch your hand or your legs, some neurons at a different location are activated. And together with S1, this is the part of your brain that enables you to recognize with your eyes closed that someone is touching the tip of your nose and not the tip of your toe, so to speak. We discovered that this area is not only activated when your body is touched, but is also activated when you see the body of someone else being touched, okay? So, we don't speak anymore of mirror neurons, but we speak of mirror mechanisms. And these mechanisms map the sensory representation of actions, emotion, or sensation of another onto the perceived zone, motor, visceromotor, or somatosensory, bodily formatted representation of those same actions, emotion, and sensation. So this is a highly controversial notion. Are we entitled to use the notion of representation if we are not dealing with linguistic knowledge? We think we can. So the idea is that the very same content can be mapped in a variety of representations. Some of those representations are the standard kind of representation you want to think of. They are mediated by language. Other representations are come in another format, a bodily format. And this bodily format is constrained by the way our body is built, is formed, has evolved in a specific physical world in interaction with other bodies. So this mapping enables to perceive actions, emotion, or sensation of another as if performing those actions or experiencing some content of that emotion or sensation. So my point is not this is the only way of making sense of what other people are doing. This is probably the most direct and the oldest way we have at our disposal to make sense of what other people are doing. We can map those very same emotions by relying on other resources. Even if my facial muscles are paralyzed because I suffer of Mebius syndrome, I can still tell a sad face from a happy face, but I rely on a different kind of information. I learn to discriminate different gestalts. Simply, I rely on vision heavily or exclusively, and I combine those gestalts with a linguistic description that describes how does it feel when you are happy or when you're sad. This goes directly to the neural machinery that normally works when you are happy or you are sad. So that's why we believe it is closely related to the notion of empathy, although the notion empathy is a polysemic word, and we could devote an entire series of workshops and we would still be fighting. So embodied simulation is the glue that aims to give a coherence to this separate and diverse empirical sets of evidence, aims to explain the mirror mechanism and related phenomena. Is also triggered during the experience of spatiality around our body, during the contemplation of three-dimensional objects. The functional architecture of embodied simulation seems to constitute the basic characteristic of our brain, making possible our rich and diversified experience of space, objects, and other individuals, being at the basis of our capacity to empathize with them. So, not only connects us to others, but it connects us to our Umwelt, like von Uexküll would have called it, to our world, a world populated by natural objects, man-made objects, with or without symbolic nature, and other individuals, a world in which most of the time we feel at home, not always, though. So, how can this approach relate to art? For some people, it shouldn't, because art is culture all the way down, and we should keep separating Geisteswissenschaften from Naturwissenschaften, okay? Time hasn't passed for many of these people. They still rely on Detail, okay? Although Detail It's more than a century ago. But what is becoming more active in this debate is the so-called biocultural approach. So, according to the biocultural approach, art is human nature, including the evolved cognitive, motor, perceptual, and emotive hardware that we share cross-culturally. Here is Hans Gumbrecht on a book on presence. He's in Stanford, but he's a German scholar. Every human contact with the things of the world contains both a meaning and a presence component. The situation of aesthetic experience is specific inasmuch as it allows us to live both these components in their tension. So our job is to shed more light on the bodily component of aesthetic experience. I think we have plenty of stuff on the meaning part. We want to see to which extent we can approach the meaning component looking bottom up and not as usual from top down perspective. Here's a Scottish anthropologist, Tim Ingold, that has been influenced me a lot. I will organize a meeting next October in Erice in Sicily, where we will discuss images and symbol making, pulling together anthropologists, visual culture scholars, neuroscientists, and psychologists. Tim Ingold, hunters and gatherers of the past were painting and carving, but they were not producing art. I can't see it, it's too small. We trust, okay, let me read it like this. So we must cease thinking of painting and carving as modalities of the production of art and view art instead as one rather peculiar and historically very specific objectification of the activities of painting and carving. So what really thrills me here is the focus on the performativity of art, which is also at the core of the contribution of Ellen Dissanayake. A comprehensive scientific understanding of art must include its manifestation in all human culture. Cognitive neuroscience is mainly focused on the first world, and we are doing a bunch of other things. We are studying trauma in Sierra Leone, and much of our research struggles in being published in scientific journal because we cannot apply the post-traumatic stress disorder questionnaire that is normally used to validate a traumatic situation, where you're supposed to ask children that make their living trying to find food in a mountain of garbage, do you cry because your toy is broken? Can you imagine that? So these forces us to consider art as behaviors that may have no necessary connection with beauty. So I'm not so interested in beauty, I'm more interested in the performative aspect of art and in the performative aspect of aesthetic experience. So the hypothesis we have been exploring so far is that aesthetic experience can be deconstructed into its bodily grounding elements. The notion aesthetics is used mainly in its bodily account from aesthesis. It refers, therefore, to the sensory, motor, and affective features of our experience of these perceptual objects. And to use cognitive neuroscience to study the functional relation between the brain-body system and aesthetic experience. This is what we do. So the idea is that we can now look at the aesthetic symbolic dimension of human existence not only from a semiotic hermeneutic perspective, which is still enormously enriching and valid, but we can add, we can complement this perspective starting from the dimension of bodily presence. And the contribution of cognitive neuroscience is meant, as I said, to be complementary to the humanistic approach by enriching our perspective with, I'm out of time. Oh, 5 minutes, oh great. By enriching our perspective with a new level of description. So the idea is to work hand in hand with art historian, visual culture scholars, film theorists, cognitive linguists, and this is enormously enriching for cognitive neuroscience, and I'm being told that this is also enriching for the perspective used by these scholars who are fully within the human sciences. So this level of description can help analyzing and revising several concepts we normally use when referring to intersubjectivity, aesthetics, art and architecture, as well as when referring to the experience we make of them. The notion of empathy, recently explored by cognitive neuroscience, can reframe the problem of how artworks and architectural spaces are experienced, revitalizing and empirically validating old intuition on the relationship between body, Einfühlung, empathy, and aesthetic experience. There's a further element that drove me into this business, and is the notion of aesthetic experience as a mediated form of intersubjectivity. This is a quote from Siri Hustvedt. This is a beautiful book, Mysteries of the Rectangle. In art, the meeting between viewer and thing implies intersubjectivity. The intersubjectivity inherent in looking at art means that it is a personal, not an impersonal act. And her last novel is very interesting because it's based on this fictional life of a female contemporary artist who cannot have a breakthrough and then decided to produce art using male names. And it's a polyphonic novel. It's really great. So, aesthetic experience, a mediated form of intersubjectivity. So perhaps you now see clearly why someone like me decided to venture on this enterprise. And this was the starting point. The paper, the dialogue with David Friedberg, who's, as Caroline said, is now has his feet across the ocean. On one foot is at the Italian Academy at Columbia University. The other is at the Warburg Institute that he was recently appointed as director. We put forward two hypotheses. The first hypothesis, in my opinion, was rather trivial. He said, oh, no, Vittorio, it's not trivial at all. You will see if you go to an aesthetic department and you make such a claim, they will throw tomatoes at you. A crucial element of aesthetic responses consists of the activation of embodied mechanisms encompassing the simulation of actions, emotion, and corporeal sensation, and these mechanisms, though socioculturally heavily modulated, are supposedly universal, which is a very daring statement, and we need multicultural validation of this statement, of course. This basic level of reaction to images is essential to the understanding of the effectiveness both of everyday images and of works of art. And then the second hypothesis is the one I thought was most daring and thought-provoking. The felt effect of particular gestures involved in producing artworks constitutes a consistent component of our aesthetic experience and appreciation of artworks. And indeed, we published two papers using this funny hat is a net through which we record with 128 electrodes EEG, the electroencephalographic activity of the brain of beholders, while they were looking at high resolution digital reproduction of works by Lucio Fontana and controlled stimuli where we remove the dynamic form present in his works, so the invagination in the canvas and the shade. And the outcome is that when you are looking at those images, no matter how familiar you are with those images, you activate the motor region of the hand. So the same region that normally would come into play if you yourself were slashing the canvas with the razor blade. Similar results with the more sophisticated analysis, I have no time to get to the details, we got using another contemporary artist, Franz Klein. Here you don't have cuts, you have very dynamic brush strokes, and the result is the same. And following the same logic, we recently moved into cinema, and we published a paper on camera movements, comparing different ways of filming the same scene with a static camera, with the zoom lens, with the dolly, or with a Steadicam. And we did another experiment on montage, and but again, we are not original. This thing has been written many times in the past. This guy was probably not a very good artist, not so compelling, but incredibly thought-provoking theoretician, Adolf von Hildebrand. Creation and response to art are directly related. To understand an artistic image means to implicitly grasp its creative process. And through movement, the available elements in space can be connected, objects can be carved out of their background and perceived as such. Through movement, representations and meaning can be formed and articulated. And I think that we are producing the brain-body counterpart of these ideas. So embodied simulation can shed light on human symbolic expression, both from the point of view of its making and of its experience. In so doing, it reveals the intimate intersubjective nature of any creative act. The physical object, the outcome of symbolic expression, becomes the mediator of an intersubjective relationship between creator and beholder. It generates the peculiar quality of the embodied scene as that plays a significant role in aesthetic experience, and it is one important ingredient of our appreciation of human symbolic expression. This is the last one, and this is the cover of a book that came out in Italy just a couple of days ago, hopefully soon translated in English, and it's on the relationship between watching a movie and what's going on in your brain. Thank you.
No. Stay. Thank you very much.
Now you're going to shoot me.
Well, maybe. No, I wanted to ask if there were any questions. I have one, and here's one. Go ahead. And then one back there.
Yeah.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. About this empathy phenomenon, I recently heard that if kids weren't in touch with nature enough till they're 5 or 6 years old, they weren't able to build up this empathy. Is it a legend?
So if kids
Are not in
are
touch
what?
with the outside world, the environment, what we used to call nature.
Oh, well, there are, for a variety of human skills, there are time windows which, if you go beyond that time window, you are not able to develop in a fully competent way those skills. For example, language is one example. You may find a way of, so to speak, communicate with others, but definitely not with the proficiency as like when you learn language from the very beginning. Can empathy be taught? There are people who believe it can be taught. Even more, compassion can be taught. There are colleagues of mine in Leipzig. Tanya Singer, she's collaborating with Buddhist monks, meditators, and they are working on this sort of projects. Our brain is definitely much more plastic than we thought. Even a bunch of years ago, we discovered that neurons can be formed, newly formed. When I was a student, that was a dogma, that the only thing that happens once you are born is that you start losing neurons. So it's a kind of countdown. So,
Yeah, that's...
now we discovered that a neuron can be newly formed. We discovered that a neuron can establish a new synaptic connection. It has been demonstrated that if you train a monkey to use a rake to retrieve a distant object, after 2 weeks of intense training, the part of the brain that controls those movements becomes thicker because there are new synaptic connections.
Vittorio, that's not the question. But it's very interesting. I think he asked if there's any research on the connection between the increase of empathy and the presence of ourselves in the so-called natural world. Yeah. That's a specific question.
But who is deprived of the natural world?
Well, almost everybody. When they're, nowadays they're always wired and they're always inside. I would agree with you, though. Even though I'm not a neuroscientist, I think that if you neuroscientists did a test on this, maybe nobody's done a test, it would come up that it's true, because somehow it's a theosophical question. Pietro can address.
I have no brain data. I can tell you, we established some relationship with a group of people in Reggio Emilia, which is the city very close to Parma, where I live and work, where they have a long tradition in kindergarten. They had the cover of Time or a long time ago. So what they show me is how a 4 or 5 years old child draw flowers before and after having the possibility to swim, literally, among flowers, and the difference is really compelling. But they don't, they combine the contact with nature with the usage of the latest digital technologies. So these young children play with webcams, so they learn how to use them to explore objects from a variety of point of views. So I don't think we should demonize computers, tablets, and the like. I mean,
no, but on the other hand, I mean, you go back to Merleau-Ponty, and Merleau-Ponty's last works were always speaking about this, la chair du monde, the world as a large place.
There is a lot of unexplored share also in these devices, if you think about it. I don't want to keep too much time, but this is something I'm ready to start to work. For example, if you think about it, we never had the possibility to change images by moving our hands. I mean, you can draw, of course, but you cannot change an image of someone else on a digital media until people came up with these devices. You enlarge, you zoom, so the relation with those images is different. And you are watching images in predominantly within your peripersonal space. The peripersonal space which is mapped by those multimodal neurons. So I think this should force us to reconceptualize many things when dealing with our relationship with images using these new technologies, and perhaps neuroscience has something to say about that.
There was a question back there.
Yeah.
I was, just interested in when you're talking about the way that the brain responds to actions and objects and sort of the potentiality of the object.
Yeah.
I assume the ramification of that is that we're just being, like, our brain is constantly operating on this frequency, so all the world around us is constantly stimulating us in this way, so it would...
No, that's a very good point. No, most of these effects occur when the object is within our attentional focus.
Okay.
So as I'm walking down a street, my mirror neurons don't go nuts because in my peripheral vision, you don't need to foveate to have the firing of the cells. At least with this granularity, we could show that only in the animal model. But you need to pay attention to it. If you don't pay attention, you mind your own business.
Right.
There's no discharge.
So there's like a spectrum of sort of attention, and
Yeah.
But for instance, if I was to canvas my eyes across your table with relative sort of detail, then that would essentially do the same thing you're talking about. Look at the computer, look at the microphone, look at the tape.
In order to get the results, I briefly summarized, people were watching those images for 2 seconds.
Okay, cool.
So it's very short. I was talking today with someone about, I was at a meeting at Tate Modern, And this psychologist did a study in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, so where they were trying to calculate on average how much time visitors spend in front of each painting on display in that museum, and the average is between 4 and 5 seconds. Of course, people maybe spend more time in front of the night watch, but not much more than that. So we still want to call that an aesthetic experience? I don't know. Definitely our artificial approach. At the beginning I thought, what are we going to say? I mean, it's too short. But then I realized that it's not much shorter than the average time that people spend when looking at paintings hanging on a wall of a gallery or a museum.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you try doing a test with a real fontana and then an image of a fontana and see?
No.
I suggest
that was
that.
the original idea of David. But we have incredible problems in doing that with the real thing, because to do these studies you need to sample the brain activity of 15, 20 people. Because one single subject is not enough. You don't have enough statistical power. So you see, it's really gross, it's really coarse, but nevertheless, that's the way it does with the technology currently available, which requires a standardization of timing. So everyone must look at those images exactly the same amount of time, and the recording of the brain activity has to be very sharply time-locked with the appearance of the image. We could use the timing of the lighting but no one would lend me a fontana.
I will lend you one.
In my lab. Or I mean,
no problem.
It would be a lot more complicated.
Okay, so I think the time question exists, and we're running half an hour late almost, I realize. But there's one more question. There's two more questions. There's three. Okay, you have to answer with one word.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
In these experiments, does the prior knowledge of the subject matters? I mean, if you have an acquaintance.
Okay, that's one word.
Okay.
Yeah, next.
Same effect in people who do it.
I would like to ask the possibility of a word in terms of sensory-motor experience. For example, the problem of translation.
Yeah.
When I say thank you, there is the image of representation of thanking, which is equal in different languages. But when I say thank you, something different happens to you, bodily, performatively. And when I say teşekkür ederim, because of the difference of sounds, something different happens to you. Would you like to consider this as part of your research?
Yeah, I mean, we have been doing research on language, but this would lead me...
That's not your work.
So the same level of embodiment can be scoped also with words.
But it's not your field.
Sorry?
It's not really your field.
No, it's my field.
It's also your
I've
field.
been doing a lot of stuff.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I do many things.
Okay. Okay, I think last question.
Hello. So, assuming that human brain is same with 10,000 years ago human brain, and assuming that we are more obsessed with aesthetics now compared to ages ago, I was wondering, an artwork made 30,000 years ago, a half lion, half human shaped sculpture, how would that reference to our understanding?
Well,
I have something to say
I don't
about
think we have the same brain that we had 30,000 years ago. And at the same time, I think to define those images as artworks is not appropriate. I mean, we consider them artworks within our contemporary canon, but their meaning was probably very different for the people who draw them and for the people who had the possibility to behold them. I think most likely it had to do, I mean, art is still a glue which is fundamental. What we now call art, symbol making or making images, I think is a more general term, is very important in building collective identity. This collective identity, most likely in those times, had a much more prominent ritual or religious meaning than it has nowadays that we live in a almost, well, not almost, but in the Western world, in a predominantly secularized world, so no one has the same attitude as when performing a religious rite, when entering into a museum.
Yeah, I have something
although a museum in a way is a sort of mausoleum.
Yeah, but Vittorio, here is where we divide.
Okay.
Because I think that
good, so we have some
it's good. No, it's true. But I think that this vision of the definition of art is indeed something that was established in the 18th century, and that created art history in the 19th century, and went through its anti-art versions in the 20th century. But now I think in the so-called Anthropocene, whatever we want to call that, many very interesting artists like Pierre Rigue or others are actually not feeling comfortable in this anthropocentric definition of art. And they are indeed looking at something much broader, which is a co-sharing of creativities with also other sentient beings, whether it's a bacteria or a bee.
Okay.
And so, in a way, you are speaking about art in a definition that artists themselves, some artists themselves, are no longer comfortable with. So they're breaking that boundary. Yeah. Also because when you identify a paradigm, the paradigm is already over, generally. I mean, when you are able to identify something so clearly.
The only point.
But we have to end. So you have the last word.
No, I don't want to have, I don't think I have any last word on anything, much less on these topics. But my point was that I have some problem in putting a Fontana and an entopic vision-like image carved on a wall 50,000 years ago. I have some difficulty in putting them in the same ballpark.
Yes, I understand. Thank you. Okay.